This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our third installment of Ask an Arborist series. I'm Gwen Kozlowski, the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. I'm based at UVM Extension, but it is a collaborative effort between UVM Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We are so lucky to have Bill Conn with us today. He is a utility arborist with the Vermont Electric Power Company, and he's here to share a little bit about his work and open up to questions. So I think some of you have participated in one of these calls before, so it's a little bit different than our typical offerings. It's really intended to be a little less informal, so feel free to turn your camera on or turn your camera off, no problem either way. You could use the chat feature on the right-hand side, which is the little chat bubble in between people and the gear icon. That you could type your questions in there, or you can unmute yourself since we've got a smaller group. So with that, I'll give it to Bill. Please, Bill, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at VELCO?
Thanks for having me. Thank you. So yeah, I'm a utility forester at Vermont Electric Power Company. Most people refer to us as VELCO. We're based out of Rutland, Vermont. We have about 12,800 acres of right-of-way we manage throughout the state, 52 substations spread out throughout the state. The voltages that we work with are 115,000 volts, 345,000 volts, 230,000 volts, and 450 DC. And those lines are spread out throughout the state, and I'm one of three that oversee the maintenance and the safe operation of these lines throughout the state. I primarily manage the vegetation growth and the landscape mitigation plantings that we do throughout the state. I've been with VELCO for about 14 years. I've been a certified arborist since June of 2006 or 1996, about a year after I got out of college.
Wow. Just thinking about the number of acres that you manage for right-of-ways, that's quite a job that you've got going there. Can you tell us what it looks like for you in a day-to-day? I mean, you had just mentioned, if you haven't noticed, Bill's actually outside, and he's located in Grand Isle right now, doing some work, and he was able to fit us in here. So what does a day-to-day look like for you for managing all those trees and vegetation growth?
So in the springtime, we're out trying to get our landscape plantings and aesthetic plantings in the ground. We try to do that between May and June, so we can optimize the cooler weather and get our irrigation set up for the plantings where we have that capability. So that consumes probably 3 or 4 weeks of my time this year. We're gearing up to do our inventory, which is where we start setting up next year's work. So we'll be setting up our 2022 work this spring. So we'll be out walking the lines. We do about a quarter of our system a year. We have 738 miles of line, so we do about 180 miles a year that we inventory for work. And on a yearly basis, we manage about 185 miles of line. So that'll take us 10 to 12 weeks to do, 5 days a week. We try to fit crew visits in there because we already have crews that are out doing the 2021 vegetation work for us. That's 2 contractors do that work for us throughout the state, and there's 3 of us foresters that oversee that. With one of us, we have a supervisor that oversees us.
That's a lot of work. Are those surveys done on foot, you said, or by car? What is the inventory? I want to dig a little bit deeper into what that inventory looks like on the ground.
So the inventory process for us, it is on foot or an ATV, but most of the time somebody is walking along the edge of the right-of-way. We look at every single tree that grows on the edge of the right-of-way, along with all the floor species that grow underneath the conductor. So in the fall, before we do our inventory, we actually have a company that does LiDAR for us. They fly the line, measure all the trees along the edge of the right-of-way, and let us know what trees are tall enough to make contact with the wire. And then once we get that data back from them in January, we put it into our inventory program that's developed within VELCO. We are currently changing that, program to be at a house because we outgrew the one we developed in our house at VELCO. So we'll walk the right of way. We look at every tree. We do like a level 1 assessment, a risk assessment on that to see if it meets the guidelines for removal, or we'll monitor it for another cycle, which our cycle is 4 years. And if we do choose to remove it, it gets painted with a red or orange X, entered in our computer program, and we collect the height of the tree, the diameter of the tree, and the species. And then it's GPS located so the crew can find it the following year to do the maintenance work.
Wow. That is quite a process. And the use of LiDAR, how many years have you been able to, that's such a, it seems like a new tool and such a wonderful thing to use. Is how'd you get introduced or incorporate that into your plans?
So we had seen LiDAR. We've been using LiDAR since 2010 for vegetation purposes. We've used it on some of our new clearing projects to lay out roads or look at different topography, but we started using LiDAR for vegetation purposes in 2010. It definitely helps us. It saves us a lot of time, but it also helps us hone in on what trees we really need to look at and what trees have potential to cause an outage. So in 2010, we flew our whole system to kind of get a baseline of LiDAR, and then we fly each cycle year. So we only fly a quarter of our cycle every year. So within a 4-year period, we refly the whole cycle, the whole system.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, again, for those of you who are just joining us, we've got Bill Conn, the utility arborist or utility forester. I think I misspoke on your title.
It depends. It's pretty much I'm a certified utility arborist.
Okay, great.
Now that Vermont has gone to the certified forester concept.
Gotcha. Okay, well, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. You could keep your cameras off if you wish, or use the chat feature in between the people icon and the gear icon, and I'd be happy to read those questions out. Anything come into mind for Bill? Adam, it looks like you had a question.
Yeah, when you say you do your landscape plantings, are you talking like pollinator style habitats underneath the power lines, or?
So we do both. When we select our trees and our shrubs to plant around substations, we definitely look at pollinators. If we're close to residential areas, we try to plant edibles, apples, blueberries, stuff like that, so people that live around the substations have that benefit. We usually get a lot of requests around substations for blueberries and apples, and we're more than happy to plant those if it's the right tree in the right place. So we try to have our planting plans reflect what those species are. We do a lot of public outreach before we select the plantings with our landscape architect.
That's great, and I'm curious, as a utility arborist, the push-pull of being an advocate for trees and also having to manage them and cut them down to provide power to folks. What kind of conflicts are there? What's it like working with residents? You know, you noted that you do a lot of public outreach. Just curious what that balance is like for managing trees and also, you know, making sure we have good power.
It's definitely a balance. Everyone that I work with, we all went to school to save and protect trees, but we all ended up working for a utility company. So we're taking out trees that are typically unhealthy. They're not safe. They have defects. So we try to get that out of the landscape so we can have safe, reliable power. And it does cause issues sometimes with landowners, but we meet with them. They understand what we have to do, and we understand how they feel. We try to treat everyone's property like it's our own. So we try to leave it as we find it. When we do remove trees and brush, we leave the wood for the landowner to salvage and use as firewood or logs. Where it's needed, we will chip brush if it's on somebody's front lawn and grind a stump out and replant for them if it's a manicured lawn. So it's a balance that I think VELCO is really good at, and a lot of landowners we work with. I see somebody on the call. I think she is a landowner over in our Rygate area, Alice, possibly.
You're
So
right.
I know.
You're right, Bill.
So I know we're going to be working with her probably over the next few months about herbicide and what they're going to be doing on their property. They're going into a new carbon sequestration program. So we definitely do enjoy working with landowners and help with that.
Awesome, and welcome to those who just joined. Again, we've got Bill Conn here, a utility arborist. Feel free to ask your questions by unmuting yourself or using the chat feature. You just touched on something that we were chatting about earlier too. VELCO is the only utility in Vermont that is a tree line USA. Can you speak to what that means and what that work looks like?
So that's a designation through the Arbor Day Foundation that we went after, and I believe the first year we received that award was 2008, so it would have been our 2007 maintenance cycle. It's a program the Arbor Day Foundation has to document. We have to document the outreach we do with the public and based on what we plant for trees and how engaged we are with our communities, and what we do with our inventory programs and how we manage our right-of-ways. And I believe this is our 13th year that we have received that designation. It's a lot of work. It's keeping track of how much money you spend on plantings, and part of that is the training we do for our contract crews every year. We have usually 2 trainings for our contract crews about safety on many facets of the work we do in the right-of-way. But along with best management practice, we review state regulations for herbicide applications, rare, threatened, and endangered plants. That training we have in the spring and fall, we go over what those plants and animals are that are going to be within our maintenance cycle this year, how to protect them, how to mitigate them, when we can work around them, and when we have to be away from them.
Great, thank you. And it is a ton of work to get that designation, and quite an honor, because it's not something that's bestowed on folks willy-nilly. Like you said, there's a lot of documentation. There's all those components. I just put a link in the chat if you're curious. There are 5 other components with an Arbor Day celebration, tree-based energy conservation, planting and public education, the worker training, and quality tree care. So it is a high standard to meet, and it's and that's in part why we wanted to invite Bill to be able to share his experience too, because it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, and that work is definitely not done by just me. There's 4 other people in my department that help me and VELCO get that designation every year.
Great, go ahead, Elise.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of piggybacking on that question. You are a utility arborist, so curious if you could talk a little bit to how that's different than just an arborist, and what kind of training and or things you are taking into consideration other than just the tree when you're looking at work around lines.
So I first became a certified arborist in 1996, and then I got my utility certification in 2002. It's another year of training to become a utility certified arborist. You have to understand the components of the electrical grid, clearances, how close you can get to vegetation that's growing within the proximity of electrical lines. It's definitely more training. And to me, I treat them both the same. We're both out there trying to make sure trees are safe for people. It's just we're not necessarily managing trees on someone's front yard every day. It's through quarters. It's a lot of land that is vacant, at least on our system. But you get around the more populated cities like Burlington, Williston, Essex, Bennington, and stuff like that, where we do have lines, it does become more residential. And then you still have to manage those trees individually, but it's for the safe reliability of the electrical grid.
Thank you. That just sparked a question for me too, thinking about one of the big challenges that you are likely facing that we haven't touched on yet, which is emerald ash borer. So I'm curious to see what your plans are for response to that, or how does that emerald ash borer, the invasive pest, fit into your work right now?
So emerald ash borer, I believe it's been in Vermont now since 2017, correct? At least that's over in the Groton area.
Yeah, 2018, I think.
2018. So once we found out about that, we have a big transmission line that runs through Groton over the quarter of Route 302 from pretty much east to west where they originally found it. we were proactive in that. We started looking at ash trees then, and going out and trying to look at the ones that were tall enough to make contact with our conductors before they got the insect, because they become less safe to work on or be around once they do have the insect. So over the last 3.5 years, we have been proactively trying to remove those ash trees before they become a problem for us. So I think around 7% of our inventory is ash trees on our power lines. So it's been a big push to get those trees down. We've worked with landowners, especially if they're going to be logging those areas. We've tried to go out and mark the ash trees that we want to remove. And if they didn't feel comfortable remove them because they were too close, we would go out and remove them for them ahead of time. So they were able to salvage that, and it was safer for us and our crews to be around those trees.
Wow, that's a lot more work to your normal day-to-day stuff. That's for sure.
It for sure did. It almost doubled our hazard trees in one cycle.
Wow. Wow. Adam had a question. How do you manage your lines that go through the Green Mountain National Forest?
So we manage them the same way we do through any part of our system. We regularly meet with a Green Mountain National Forester that's in charge of the area. It's pretty much down in Bennington. So we meet with them, go over what our needs are, what their needs are, and they're a really good partner to work with. So it's pretty easy for us. It's not like out on the West Coast where they work with a BLM and other stuff like that. I don't seem to have the problems here that other colleagues out on the West Coast have working in National Forest.
That's great. And Jeff made a comment that VELCO is one of 7 utilities, only 7, in North America that have been accredited by the Right-of-Way Stewardship Council, and put a link in there, which is quite an honor. I'm excited to dig more into that. Bill or Jeff, do you want to share a little bit more about the Stewardship Council?
Sure, I can. It's an accreditation process where they go through and look at every aspect of your program you have, vegetation management, habitat management, and all the way down. We give them binders and binders of our program. They come out and do a field audit for a couple days when we got our first designation. They spend 2 full days with us in the field, and we're just driving around, and they pick random spots to verify that the work you claim is done is really done to the spec that we have set for ourselves and that they have. It's a long, tedious process. It's a 5-year certification. We are in, I believe, the middle of our 2nd accreditation, so we're at our mid-cycle in year 8.
Wow, that is really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about that.
And with that program, they look at our vegetation part of our program, also our environmental part of our program, to make sure that we're using mat bridges and silt fence and stuff like that where we say we're using it. So it's a whole program review, not just vegetation.
And switching gears a little bit, Alice had a question. Can you share a little bit about what herbicides you use?
So the herbicides we use, it's different. We have a 3-way herbicide mix that we use that we permit with a state, and it depends on the type of brush that we're using. We do use glyphosate, rodeo, escort. There's a 3-way mix. It's applied low volume backpack spray to each individual species that we're trying to eliminate. It's permitted through the state of Vermont. We go through a permitting process. One of our other foresters takes care of all the permitting for us. Each contractor has 2 certified applicators, and it's ultimately up to the landowner. We go out ahead of time and make notifications and to see if they really want herbicide used on their properties.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that is a balance, but a necessary one. It's, I think, the challenge of working with invasive species too. Sometimes it's a battle we can't win without herbicides, but like you mentioned, the direct application and the precautions that you take, the impact can be great with minimal effects to the natural world.
Correct, and it definitely helps us fight the invasive plants, and a lot of landowners are grateful that we go after those invasive species along the right-of-way, because a lot of time they choke out the native habitat, where the native plants can't get established to create that habitat in the right-of-way for wildlife.
Great. Elise said, speaking of invasives, what is your favorite plant and your least favorite plant?
Just invasives or overall?
Overall,
So
I guess.
my favorite tree is the red oak. I think it's a mighty tree. It starts as this little acorn, and yeah, so that's my favorite tree, the red oak. And my least favorite, I'm not really sure. I guess black locust. Trying to climb in a black locust, a young black locust with a lot of thorns, I would say is my least favorite tree to be working in.
That's for sure. Great. Thinking about so this month, the Urban and Community Forestry Program is doing a social media campaign focused on tree selection, tree site species, and a common refrain, which I've already heard you say today, is the right tree in the right place, the right way. What are some of the considerations that you have for when it comes to tree selection and putting the right tree in the right place?
So when we look at planting new trees in the right-of-way or replacing trees we've taken down for a landowner, we definitely look at species maturity height. We always try to make sure that the trees that are going to be within the right-of-way are compatible to that location as far as maximum height and stuff like that. And we always try to do native where we can. Sometimes landowners want different exotic plants and stuff like that. As long as they're permitted in the state, we don't mind doing that, as long as they're not within the right of way and can interfere with conductors. So we try to look at soil and slope and what they're going to be mature at. You can't just look at a tree and say, oh, I just got this nice 12-foot tall apple tree, it's going to do great here, and then in 10 years it's already too tall and we already have to be back out there to maintain it or remove it. So when we replace trees for landowners, we try to get them off the edge of our right-of-way so they have a long, healthy life ahead of them. We don't have to maintain them, and the landowners have something that we don't have to constantly go back and prune. Apple trees and fruit trees throughout the quarter, we try to plant berry bushes to help with wildlife habitat. And then along our substation stuff, we try to do screening with native species, white cedar, shrub willow, red osier dogwood, anything that's low growing that will help screen the substations or screen road crossings and stuff like that.
Great, thank you. Josh had a question about, do you have solar fields? And if so, has that impacted your vegetation management program?
So VELCO does not have solar fields out in our right-of-ways. At our office in Rutland, we have a new solar field with a battery storage bank. But as far as out in the right-of-way, VELCO does not own any solar fields. We do definitely get power from the other solar companies that put that solar power into the grid. It hasn't affected our vegetation management at all at this point.
Great, thank you. Elise was curious, where do you source your trees for planting?
So when I first started at VELCO, our trees were sourced from Florida to New England. And after some of VELCO's bigger planting projects in 2007, 8, and 9, where we were planting almost 5,000 trees a year when we were building new transmission right-of-ways, we found out real soon that trees coming from Florida, Virginia, the Carolinas just didn't survive well in Vermont. Red maples look great when you plant them in May, April, October. They start to not look so well in the following year. Most of the time, they never leafed out again. So we had a big push to find trees local to New England and New York, because of the climates are pretty much the same. So we spent a lot of time at a lot of nurseries, and we'd actually went out to nurseries and flagged all the trees that we wanted, because most of the time utilities get contractor grade material that nobody else wants. So after a vigorous couple of years inspecting trees when they got here, and even before they were even dug, we started sourcing trees from Western New York and all around New England. We have a few growers here in Vermont that we get a lot of our material, especially if they're not big projects. We can source them right here in Vermont. The hemlock tree is a big one because wherever they come from, they got to be inspected for the woolly adelgid. We had some this year that were sourced out of a good nursery in New York. Vermont waived the inspection process because New York's behind due to COVID, but New York wouldn't let them leave the nursery, even though Vermont said they were okay to come here. So it's a nursery out in New York that treats for them. They're inspected annually and regularly, but we were not able to source them out of New York this year, and we couldn't find the size what we wanted in Vermont, so we just ended up changing the species of trees. But yeah, insects and disease are a big one, and we try to buy from the same nurseries all the time, and our contractors that get those trees understand our specs and pretty much buy them from the same nurseries that we have been for the last 12 years.
Great. And a follow-up on that, are you planting bare root, container, or B&B trees?
So we are planting B&B trees and container grown. Most of the container stuff is local to Vermont. We're trying to plant smaller caliper trees nowadays because they seem to do better in the long run. We did a big planting in Stowe, Vermont when we upgraded a transmission line there 10 years ago, and we were planting 30-foot tall fir trees that were just too big. They had an 8 to 10 inch caliper, and we noticed the trees that were planted 6 foot in size surpassed the trees in growth and height and vigor. So now we try to spec trees in the, I'd say 7 foot and down. They seem to do a lot better for us growing.
Wow. Okay. So we've talked about, sourcing trees, invasive species. We've talked about all the management issues. What are some of the biggest challenges for trees that you see in your work?
As far as like planting it, as far as trees that we source, it's getting healthy trees that have been well taken care of, that don't have girdling roots or insect problems. In the nurseries that we buy for, know our expectations when they come, so we very rarely have to reject trees when they come from one of our nurseries. And our contractors use brokers to get them, and they just let them know up front that you can't send garbage trees to Vermont because it's a utility. So we have a good reputation with other growers out there that they send us something that you'd want in your front yard, not something that you want on your back 40.
That's a riot. And I mean, cultivating that reputation too, that sounds like it might have been a challenge over years to, get some of that poor quality stock and say, you know what, this isn't good enough for us right now.
It definitely was. There were some growing pains for the nurseries that tried to do that in the very beginning. They're like, it's a utility. They don't care what they look like. Like I said, we would go out and flag 5,000 trees at 4 or 5 different nurseries. We had locking tags that we put on all the trees. So if they showed up without a tag on it, we didn't take it because we knew we hadn't looked at it. And so we had locking tags that we put on every tree that came to Vermont for a 2 or 3 year period. We actually went out to the nurseries, flagged them, and we had one nursery send us a truckload of 7-gallon, 20-foot tall red oak trees that had roots 1.5 inch diameter out the pots. We sent back 3 tractor trailer loads of trees. So pretty much after that, they understood that we weren't just going to take trees that nobody really wanted. So it was definitely growing pains for us and the contractors, but the specs that we have at VELCO that we've developed with our landscape architect, it's pretty respected everywhere. Vermont gets good trees from the growers that we source our plant material from.
Wow, thanks so much for sharing that. That's really quite an insight to understand the relationship and what it took to get to where you are, and that's in part why the designation from Treeline USA and this other Right-of-Way Stewardship Council, I think just really commend all the incredible work that you're doing, because you could take the easy way out, I guess.
Yeah, we
so that's
don't.
really remarkable.
Where we source the trees in New York and southern New England, we don't even have to go flag them anymore. We don't even, because we don't get bad trees anymore. And the stuff here in Vermont, we'll go look at them every now and then, and we get all the good stuff.
That's great.
Well,
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Just a follow up to that. One of the things that regionally the counterparts to the Vermont program in the region are starting to talk about, with this proliferation of like million and trillion tree initiatives. We're starting to see like a pressure point on the availability of stock. Have you experienced that at all yet, or do you have any trouble finding the number of trees that you're hoping to get each year?
Up until this year, we didn't have trouble finding trees. I think this year it's more due to COVID, as nurseries couldn't get them dug. They didn't have the help to dig them. And the trees that we sourced this year for our planting, we were touch and go on whether we could get truck drivers to drive them to Vermont. We're actually a month behind our planting schedule. We wanted to be planting the end of April, the 1st of May, and they couldn't get trucks to deliver them to Vermont. So I think the more we can source them closer to Vermont, the better we're going to be. And some nurseries just aren't growing the same kind of trees anymore. Like, we can hardly source a hawthorn tree anywhere in the Northeast and Northern New York. Nurseries that had fields of them, they just don't grow them anymore. It's hard to find them. It's hard to find hemlock trees because of the woolly adelgid. And I don't think people are willing to take that risk to plant a hemlock tree that may be contaminated, and they may not be able to make a profit off it. And like even balsam fir trees, we have a hard time sometimes with them because they're grown for landscape plantings, but then it's the really boom for Christmas trees. So now they turn those fields over to Christmas trees for the next year, and they don't have that source to dig for us to plant in a landscape.
Thank you. Getting back to a more simple question, what are some of the most common tree planting mistakes that you see?
So a lot of mistakes that we see, they're planted too deep, and people do not take the basket and burlap off them. They leave the burlap just below the bark mulch, and once the bark mulch dries out, that burlap acts like a wick and wicks all the moisture right out of the dirt. And if they're not watered or taken care of, they end up drying out in the first year. They don't even make it to green out the next year. And then if they do, the baskets are left on. It gets a lot of girdling roots, or the baskets are girdled around the roots. I would say that's what we see. And if you don't open the basket and you just plant them, they come from a nursery too deep already. Just the way they're maintained and the way they're dug, when they dig them, they put anywhere from 4 to 14 inches of dirt on top of that root collar when they dig them. And if you're not opening the basket up, taking the burlap off, taking the basket off, you're already starting the tree too deep in the ground.
Wise advice, that's for sure. That's a common issue that we see as well.
And then they put too much bark mulch on it when they're done.
Yeah, from last week, Carol, I think you were on Tim Parsons' call, and he offered some advice because he's a landscape arborist. Oh my gosh,
Middlebury.
Horticulturist. Middlebury. And
Yep.
he was singing the praises of wood chip mulch and not bark, because bark is supposed to repel water. So when it's used as mulch and it's not properly fluffed, or it's keeps getting added on and it's inches deep, it really is it's not doing its job. So he actually has switched over a couple of mulch beds to wood chip mulch instead of bark mulch.
So we try to use wood chips where we can. If we're planting around a substation and we've done a clearing job there and we have a place to stockpile wood chips and let them sit for a while, we will definitely use wood chips around our substations. And then if we're planting in someone's yard, we just try to match the bark mulch that they have so it matches their landscape. But yeah, definitely wood chips are the way to go when possible.
Yeah, that was new to me information. I'm like still think I want to like sing the praises and tell everyone about it. um, Josh had a question, curious about management strategies for vegetation management as it relates to climate change. What's on your mind? Any changes to your approach on planting? That's a great question.
So definitely climate. It seems like we get a lot less moisture now during planting season. So we're having to set up more irrigation systems around our substations. Our new substations are definitely being outfitted with irrigation for the tree plantings where we can hook it up and the contractors can maintain the water source outside the substation fence because all our substations are secured areas and not everybody can get into them. You have to have clearance. So we're definitely looking at that as we're going ahead building new substations and upgrading them. We find that water is the most resource that's lacked on plantings, at least from our perspective when we're out planting. That's the hardest thing for us is making sure those trees have enough moisture in drought. Like last summer was a rough year. We used a lot of water on our plantings all last summer. Even in the late fall, we didn't have a lot of moisture coming out of the sky to help those trees. This year, the last 2 weeks, it's been pretty dry, and we're in the heavy part of our planting season. So we set up drip irrigations and soaker hose, and if not, the contractor comes back and maintains those plantings. Our contractors have to guarantee those plantings for 2 years on any VELCO substation or static mitigation project. Not so much in somebody's front yard because the landowners usually take over responsibility for that because most landowners don't want us in and out of the yard every week or every day watering, so they take care of that. And we try to make sure the plants that we plant for them are low maintenance so they can handle that.
Hey, Bill, this is Josh. What about the rest of like the mature trees? Are you guys worried about like storms or, drought killing trees or anything like that in the future?
Yes. Yeah, so we definitely worry about that. Right now, like I said, the emerald ash borer is a big one for us in trying to manage that. And yeah, the storms that we get, the icing and the high winds. And we work a lot with our meteorologists we try to pinpoint where those ice storms are going to be or the high winds. So we know where those areas of those intense storms are. So when we're in there doing maintenance, we try to focus on the, I guess, weak wooded trees or the species that seem to cause us the most problem, which for us is white pine and popple trees are the worst for us as far as failure in the right of way.
That was white pine and the popple trees are the
Popple
biggest
trees,
one?
yeah. Any in the popple family for sure.
Oh, interesting. Is that just because of their structural integrity? They're just like weak little guys?
Yeah, they're weak wooded pine trees. Usually when we're seeing them on the right of way, there's a lot of multi-leader pine trees. They have sail all year because they have dense foliage all year long. They don't seem to shed the ice and snow loads a lot, so they break. And their bending moments with the wind are usually 40% of the height of the tree is where they break off. And we have a lot of big, large white pine in Vermont, so a lot of trees, when they do fail, have potential to hit our lines. We don't have a lot of tree contact at all because we manage to our full widths of our right-of-way, which are 75 foot on each side of the center line. So our right-of-ways are 150 foot wide, so we manage them to that full width to help try to minimize tree contact with our conductors and our other substation structures.
Adam, do you have a question?
Yeah, related to like the ice damage, I remember reading about a few years ago where I can't remember if it was Connecticut or Massachusetts experimented with doing I guess you would say a little more traditional forest management along roadsides to thin some of the trees to increase the remaining trees' vigor so that they wouldn't be as susceptible to some of the storm damage. Has anything like that been considered or looked at along the power line corridors?
We haven't looked at that aspect of it, but we manage our trees along the edge of the right of way on an individual basis. So we're eliminating by our process the weak and unhealthy trees. And I believe in effect, it's really strengthening the trees that we leave along the power lines. We definitely work with landowners when they're going to be doing logging operations or cuts along the edge of the right-of-way. We try to encourage them to leave a bigger buffer than they'd probably really like to, but it helps on wind sail and making sure the trees that are left over time build up good root mass to help them stay upright. What we don't like to see is big logging operations where they leave one strip of trees, individual tree down the edge of the right-of-way, because those are susceptible to the wind sail and the ice loading and the snow loading. So in the sense, I believe we manage that way, but not on the grand scale of actually going out there and just cutting trees to manage for that.
Thank you. We're throwing all sorts of questions at you, Bill, from
That's good.
climate change to tree selection. I don't know if I prepared you for that, but thanks so much for going on all these topics. I really appreciate it.
Well, it definitely affects how we manage our right-of-way. Every topic that we're talking about, it's in some consideration of how we do our work.
Great. And I know Carol had a question. Oh, there she's coming back. Back to the wood chips. Do those last more than one season, or do those need to be added each year?
When we've used wood chips, we tend to get 2 or 3 seasons out of them because they kind of get brown or gray and faded. And around our substation, nobody really cares what they look like because they're not in somebody's front yard. So we've had them where they've lasted a long time around trees that we plant around our substations. And so, yeah, I think you're going to get more than one season. Even regular bark mulch in my own yard, I can get 2 seasons out of regular bark mulch if you fluff it and turn it over and pull the weeds out of it. Sure.
So you're saying I have to weed my garden?
You don't have to, but it's good for the plants and trees if you weed them.
Oh, great. So I got all my questions answered. Is there, Bill, anything that you wanted to speak about that we haven't covered yet today? I'll give a few minutes for people to wrap up or type or ask their questions too. We still have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we use all of our time. Anything else, Bill, that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I think it's good for landowners to engage with their utility companies on the practices that they do in the right-of-way so they can better understand how the trees are managed, and that utilities are always out there willing to work with landowners to better improve the natural landscape underneath the right-of-way corridor. I know people think utilities are out there just to cut trees down and spray chemicals because it's cheaper and faster, but that's really not what we're into. And definitely that's not what VELCO's into with our Tree Line USA accreditation and our right-of-way stewardship accreditation. We try to do what's best for the environment and what's the most effective out in the right-of-way to maintain safe, reliable power.
Thank you for making that very important note, Bill. Oh. Sorry, the garbage man's going by, so my dog is not going to bark.
I saw Alice, had a comment, but I couldn't read it fast enough. It disappeared off my screen.
I'm happy to read it. We've read that all of our power lines here in Vermont, whether transmission or distribution, are all in need of an upgrade, not just the power lines in Texas after the winter storms. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so VELCO has been upgrading their structures and their conductor over the last 5 years. So VELCO's well on their way to upgrading the grid as far as taking out the stuff that's really old. VELCO started in around the 1950s, so we do have poles that are 50 or 60 years old. And VELCO started that process 5 or 6 years ago, upgrading structures and conductor wire along our transmission right-of-ways.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you're ahead of the game there. That is like a long-term project that is hard to wrap your head around with replacement.
For sure, and it's a long, expensive process. It's a lot of permitting, but VELCO's proactive in that, and it's definitely helped the grid and Vermont's reliability as far as transmission power throughout the state of Vermont.
Elise asked, in your tenure with VELCO, what have been the most memorable storm events? That's a good one.
So we had the Noricane, I believe, of 2007 or somewhere in there, when we had that really bad windstorm late April, early May. I think it was 2007. VELCO had very little outages, but they ended up using us to help towns and cities around Vermont. I was able to, I worked with the city of Rutland to go around and flag hazardous trees after VELCO was done with their work. So that would probably be one of the biggest storms. And then I think the winter of December of 2013, we had like a mini ice storm up in the Newport area, like the week before Christmas. So trying to get all the power back on, and we didn't have very many issues, but we helped the distribution utilities get their lights back on. We flew a lot in the helicopter to find their problems for them up in the Northeast Kingdom. So yeah, those would probably be the two biggest storms that I remember as my tenure at VELCO. When I first got in this business, I worked the ice storm of 1998 when I was a tree contractor foreman in New Hampshire. I worked in Central Maine Power's grid system for 9.5 weeks in 1998.
Can't talk tree care without the 1998 ice storm, that's for
I
sure.
know.
And Carol had a question that they have electric boxes on private lots on private roads. Can we plant berry bushes or something to conceal them over time? We do have road right-of-ways.
I would say you'd have to contact your local utility. I know around substations, we try to screen those boxes where we can. You got to be so many feet away from them because the conductors come underground. But I think if you spoke with your utility or whoever owns those boxes, they may let you plant berry bushes or low-growing shrubs around them to kind of mitigate them from the landscape.
Good advice. And I just appreciate all of the right-of-way talk that we've done today, because I think of the right-of-way is the forgotten forest, I think, is as we called it in one of our grant applications.
For sure.
Because it is a public space and managed both for trees and to ensure that we have public safe, reliable power, like you had noted earlier. So it's just one of those things that we take for granted when we drive through our towns and, get safe, reliable power every day. So I appreciate all of the hard work and planning that you're doing throughout your tenure in VELCO. It's really quite amazing.
So Josh, you now live in Bristol, Vermont?
Yep. Yeah, we moved
Well,
here this fall.
yeah, we'll have to get together and catch up. I haven't seen you in a few years, since test committee for sure. Who do you work for nowadays?
Still with Davey.
Oh, nice.
Same role. My wife took a job here at the health clinic here, so we moved here.
In Bristol?
Yep.
Yeah, so we have a substation. We're actually building a new data control center right there in New Haven there, just down the road from you.
Oh, is that what's going on?
Yeah.
I keep seeing big construction, and I'm like, I know it's Vermont, so it's not a subdivision.
Right, yeah, it's definitely not a subdivision. Yeah, so I'm the chairperson for the ISA's certification test committee, and Josh was on the test committee with me back a few years ago, I think for like a 5-year tenure.
Yeah, I did my 6 years and got out.
6 years, yeah. I'm
You're
on my 11th year. I have 1 year left and I'm done.
Awesome. Well, if there's any last burning thoughts or questions, feel free to speak up now. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say, Adam, go ahead.
I have one last question for you. In the area that I live in Colorado, the main power company is Excel Power, and they have a grant cost share program where it's a 75-25, where communities can apply for money to plant trees under power lines. Do you have a similar type of program?
We don't have that type of program here. We're a transmission only company. So when we're working with landowners, we try to come up with a plan that'll benefit us both. And most of the time it's the utility covering the cost where we can. I'm not saying we do that all the time, but we try to work with landowners to minimize the cost for them. Obviously, if we're willing to plant 20 trees and they want to plant 40 trees, we'll definitely work with them so they can get the same pricing that we do on trees. They don't have to buy them wholesale. They don't have to buy them retail. They can go through us and buy them wholesale, which saves about half the cost of a tree. Like you see a tree at a nursery's $300 or $400 for a, I don't know, 2.5-inch caliper tree. We're buying them wholesale for like $150 a tree. So we try to work with landowners that way when we can. I think our distribution utilities may do something similar where they try to cost share if they can. It would be up to the different distribution utilities.
Great. Thank you so much for speaking to that and to all the different topics that we threw at you today. I just can't thank you enough, Bill, for your dedication, your years of work, and your really thoughtful and innovative way in handling right-of-way management to provide both trees and for safe, reliable power. So just thank you so much for your time today and for making time in your field schedule to be able to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I truly enjoy doing this.
Well, thank you very much. And with that, everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye now.
Bye.